There are 47,382 rivets in the observation portal frame before me. I've counted them 9,461 times. Each count takes approximately 73 minutes if I don't lose focus. I lose focus frequently now. My name is Jeremiah Kaust, and I have been standing at this window for 20 years, 4 months, and 17 days. The logistical officers told me I was serving the Imperium. They told me my eyes would be the difference between salvation and damnation for 14,000 souls aboard the transport vessel Unending Conviction. They promised my service would be remembered, that my vigilance protected humanity from the horrors beyond reality's skin. They lied about everything except the horrors, but I should start earlier. I should tell you about the boy who climbed aboard this ship with hope still beating in his chest, like a second heart. The boy who believed the imperial propaganda printed on conscription notices throughout Hive Tertius. The boy who thought staring at the void was a kind of honor. I was 19 years old when the labor assessors came to the factory district. My hands were still smooth then, not yet marked by the tremors that make my fingers dance against my will when I try to keep them still. I worked the Promethean refineries on the lower levels, breathing chemical fog for 16 hours a shift, watching men's lungs solidify into black stone inside their chests. My father had died that way when I was 14, coughing up fragments of his own respiratory system until he drowned in the pieces of himself. I held his hand during the final hours. He couldn't speak by then. His eyes were the only part of him still soft. I didn't want to die like that. When the assessors announced they needed crew for the merchant fleet, I volunteered immediately. I was young. I was stupid. I thought the void between stars would be cleaner than the fog between factory walls. The selection process was efficient. They lined us up. 231 young men from the Hive, all desperate for escape, and walked down the row with Auspex readers and gene scanners. Most were rejected immediately. Genetic deviations, insufficient musculature, psychological instability markers. The rejections were absolute and final. By final, I mean those men were processed into corpse starch before the day ended. The Imperium wastes nothing, not even failure. I passed every scan. Perfect genetic baseline. No mutations, no aberrant psychology markers. 20/20th's vision in both eyes. The lead assessor, a man whose augmetic jaw clicked when he spoke, placed his hand on my shoulder and said words I would remember forever. You have the eyes of an angel, boy. The Emperor needs men who can see his truth. I believed him. The conditioning had worked exactly as designed. They assigned me to Unending Conviction 3 days later. The ship was 7 miles long, a merchant-class vessel hauling manufactured goods and conscripts between systems. 14,000 souls lived and worked inside her hull. I learned later that 60% of those souls never saw natural light after boarding. They lived in the interior decks, working machinery or serving as components in systems too complex for their understanding, born and dying in corridors lit only by emergency lumens. I thought I was lucky. I was assigned to Observation Station Gamma 7, a posting that meant I would see the void itself. I would stand at the threshold between reality and whatever lay beyond. The orientation officer, a thin man whose eyes never focused properly, explained my duty with mechanical precision. You will monitor real space through the observation portal. Your station watches the starboard aft quadrant. You will observe for warp incursions, reality distortions, and anomalous phenomena. If you observe anything irregular, you will press the red alert stud. If corruption manifests within your station, you will press the black stud marked eject. This preserves the ship. Your duty is absolute. Your vigilance is eternal. The Emperor protects those who serve. He spoke the phrase with the conviction of a man reciting multiplication tables. The words were sounds he'd been trained to produce, nothing more. They didn't tell me I would stand at this window for 20 years without relief. They didn't mention that observation duty meant being bolted into a harness that fed nutrients directly into my bloodstream, while waste was extracted through tubes that had become part of my flesh. They didn't explain that my eyes would be held open by medical-grade clamps attached to my skull, or that moisture would be maintained by automated systems that had failed 400 days into my service, forcing me to blink manually every 2.3 seconds or suffer corneal damage. They certainly didn't tell me that the isolation would eat my mind from the inside out, like parasites consuming a corpse. The station itself is a coffin made of steel, 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep, 7 feet tall. The observation portal, the window I was assigned to watch, dominates the forward wall, a massive sheet of reinforced transparent steel that offers an unobstructed view of the void. Behind me, the harness that holds my body upright, the nutrient feed tubes, the waste extraction systems, the Vox bead that never produces sound anymore, and 2 buttons. The red button, the black button. I've looked at those buttons 400 million times. The first month was the hardest because I still thought like a human being. I experienced boredom. I felt my muscles cramping. I noticed the smell of my own body, the sweat that accumulated in the harness padding, the chemical tang of the nutrient paste being pumped into my stomach. I tried to speak into the Vox bead, reporting for duty, requesting status updates, asking questions that dissolved into silence. No one ever answered. I learned later, much later, when I developed the ability to interpret the maintenance schedules, printed on supply crates that servitors occasionally delivered, that the Vox system in this section had been damaged during a pirate attack 11 years before. My assignment. Repairs were listed as low priority, non-critical. My reports had been screaming into dead equipment for 2 decades, every alert I'd filed, every request for relief, every desperate plea during the early years when I still believed someone might hear me. Static and silence, that's all there ever was. But in that first month, I was still Jeremiah Coust. I still remembered my father's face with perfect clarity, the way his beard grew in patches, the scar over his left eyebrow from a factory accident, the gentleness in his expression when he read aloud from the Imperial Primer on rest days. I remembered my brother, Marcus, 5 years younger, who'd escaped conscription due to a twisted spine. I wondered if he was still alive. I wondered if anyone did. I watched the void and saw nothing but darkness and distant stars that didn't move. The unending conviction traveled through real space at that time, making a routine circuit between forge worlds. The view never changed. Darkness, stars, more darkness. The monotony was absolute. I tried to count things to stay alert. The rivets first, then the imperfections in the transparent steel. Tiny scratches, manufacturing flaws, microscopic stress fractures. Then my own heartbeats. I calculated that my heart beat approximately 2.6 million times per month. That helped me track time when I realized the chronometer built into my station had stopped working somewhere around day 43. Month 2 brought the first changes. My legs began to atrophy. The harness held me upright, but I wasn't walking, wasn't moving anything below my waist. The muscle tissue began converting to something softer, weaker. I could feel it happening, a gradual dissolution of strength that I couldn't prevent. I tried flexing my legs, tensing and releasing muscles, but the harness prevented real movement. My attempts were futile. The tremors started in my hands during month 3, small at first, barely noticeable. My fingers would twitch without conscious command, dancing through patterns I didn't choose. I thought it was a medical issue. I thought someone would come to check on me. I pressed the red alert stud. I waited. No one came. I pressed it again the next day, and the day after, and every day for 2 weeks until I understood that the alert system, like the Vox bead, was connected to nothing. My station was isolated, a sealed box with a window. Whatever happened to me would happen alone. That was when I first felt fear give way to something else. Not acceptance, not peace, but a kind of hollow recognition that this was simply what existence would be now. Standing, watching, waiting, forever. Month 6 brought the first warp transition. The bridge crew, somewhere far above in sections I would never see again, engaged the Geller field and punched through reality's membrane into the immaterium. I wasn't prepared for what that meant. The void outside my window changed. The darkness remained, but it began to move. Currents of color that shouldn't exist flowed past the hull, purples that hurt to perceive, greens that seemed to have depth and dimension beyond normal space, reds that pulsed like living tissue. Shapes formed and dissolved in the distance. I saw what might have been tentacles the size of continents. I saw eyes that opened in the fabric of unreality itself, pupils dilating as they swept past the ship. I saw things that looked back. The training documentation had mentioned warp phenomena. The orientation officer had explained that I might observe unusual visual data during a immaterium transit. They described it as normal operational conditions that required monitoring but not alarm unless anomalies manifested within close proximity to the hull. They'd made it sound clinical, professional, manageable. They'd never described the screaming. I couldn't hear it with my ears. The station was sealed, soundproofed, isolated from the rest of the ship. But I felt it in my skull. A pressure that built behind my eyes and pushed against the inside of my forehead like something trying to crack out through the bone. The colors outside the window seemed to vibrate at frequencies that bypassed my optical nerves and spoke directly to whatever part of my brain processed raw terror. I stared because that was my duty. The conditioning held firm. I watched for corruption. I watched for reality tears. I watched for demons. I saw all of those things during that first warp transit, but they stayed at a distance. Shapes that might have been ships or might have been entities drifted past, flashes of light that could have been weapons fire or could have been eyes opening and closing. Streams of color that resolved briefly into faces screaming in perpetual agony before dissolving back into abstract horror. The transit lasted 17 days, according to my internal counting. 17 days of staring into a dimension that shouldn't exist, watching colors that physics couldn't explain, feeling pressure in my skull that slowly, methodically, began to change the way my thoughts formed. When we returned to real space, I cried. Actual tears. My body still produced them then. I sobbed with relief as the void outside my window returned to simple, beautiful darkness and distant, unchanging stars. I had never loved anything as much as I loved that ordinary darkness in that moment. But something had changed inside me. The shapes I'd seen in the warp had left impressions. When I closed my eyes, during the brief moments when the automated moisture system still functioned and I could rest my eyelids, I saw those shapes again. They moved inside my memory with the same fluid wrongness they'd possessed in real space. They weren't fading. They were growing clearer. Month 9 brought the second warp transit. Then month 11 brought a third. Each time we pierced reality's skin, I stood at my window and observed the madness beyond. Each time the shapes grew more distinct, the colors became more vibrant. The pressure in my skull intensified, and I began to notice something. The colors were forming patterns. Not random swirls and chaos, but structured patterns that repeated. Geometric shapes that folded in dimensions I shouldn't be able to perceive. Spirals that contained smaller spirals that contained smaller spirals descending into infinite regress. Lattices of light that connected points across impossible distances. Mathematics existed in that chaos. Structure. Order. Not human order. Something else. Something vast and ancient and completely indifferent to human categories of meaning. But order, nonetheless. I started tracking the patterns, counting, calculating, finding rhythms in the way the colors pulsed and flowed. I discovered that if I focused on the mathematical relationships, the pressure in my skull decreased slightly. The screaming became a drone I could almost ignore. The fear transformed into something more like intense concentration. I was learning to read the warp the way my father had taught me to read the Imperial Primer. Slowly, carefully, finding meaning in symbols that had seemed like chaos. The ship's command staff, those distant figures who made decisions in rooms I would never see, would have called this corruption. They would have said the warp was infiltrating my mind, preparing me for possession. They would have pressed the black button themselves, ejecting me into the void to preserve the ship. But I knew something they didn't. I knew because I stood at this window for hours and days and months and years, while they cycled through their shifts and slept in their beds and ate their meals and lived their lives. I knew because I had nothing else to do but watch and learn and understand. The warp wasn't infiltrating my mind. My mind was adapting to perceive something that had always been there. Like eyes adjusting to darkness, my consciousness was learning to function in an environment it hadn't been designed for. The madness wasn't corruption entering me. It was sanity leaving, because sanity was a luxury designed for people who lived in predictable reality, with breaks from observation and human contact and sensory variation. I had none of those things. Year 3 brought complete atrophy of my lower body. My legs no longer existed in any functional sense, just meat hanging in the harness, kept alive by nutrient feeds but serving no purpose. I couldn't feel them anymore. Sometimes I forgot they were part of me. I would look down during rare moments when I let my eyes drift from the window and feel surprise at seeing legs attached to my torso. They seemed like foreign objects, attachments that belonged to someone else. My hands still functioned, though the tremors had intensified. My fingers never stopped moving now. They traced patterns in the air, geometric shapes that mirrored the patterns I saw in the warp. I wasn't controlling the movement consciously. My nervous system had been rewired by years of observation, and now my hands moved in sympathy with the colors outside my window. I discovered this during Year 4, Warp Transit 47. I was watching a particularly complex pattern form, interlocking spirals of purple and green that pulsed with rhythms that matched my heartbeat. My hands began moving without conscious direction, fingers tracing arcs and circles that perfectly mirrored the pattern I observed. When the pattern in the warp shifted, my hands shifted with it, perfectly synchronized. My body had become a receiver, translating visual data into kinesthetic response without requiring my conscious mind as an intermediary. I should have been terrified. The orientation materials would have called this mutation corruption, evidence of warp taint requiring immediate termination. But I felt nothing except mild interest. Fear was an emotion I'd exhausted somewhere in Year 2. Now I simply observed my own transformation with the same detachment I brought to observing the void. My father's face was beginning to fade from memory around this time. I tried to recall his features and found them blurring. The scar over his eyebrow disappeared first, then the exact shade of his beard. Was it brown or gray? Had it been both? I couldn't remember. The sound of his voice reading the Imperial Primer dissolved into approximation. I knew he'd had a voice. I knew it had produced words, but the specific timbre and tone were gone. My brother's face went next. Marcus, 5 years younger, twisted spine. Had he been taller than me or shorter? I couldn't recall. His features were a blur, a generic placeholder where specific memory had once existed. I was forgetting how to be human because humanity requires context, other humans to reference, experiences to compare, variations in stimuli to process. I had none of those things. I had the window. I had the void. I had the colors that bled through reality when we pierced into the warp. Those were becoming my context, my references, my reality. Year 7 brought the first time I saw the face. We were 16 hours into Warp Transit 143 when it happened. The colors outside were particularly active that day. Great currents of gold and crimson that flowed past the hull like rivers of light. I was tracking a spiral formation that had caught my attention, watching the way smaller eddies formed along its edges, when the entire pattern suddenly cohered. The colors weren't random. They were a face. Massive beyond comprehension, stretching across what might have been light years or might have been inches. Distance has no meaning in the warp. Features that shifted between beauty and horror with each pulse of light. Eyes that contained galaxies. A mouth that opened to reveal layer upon layer of teeth made from screaming stars. And it was looking at me, not at the ship, not at humanity in general, at me specifically. I felt its attention like weight pressing against my chest. The pressure in my skull intensified 1,000-fold. My hands froze in mid-gesture, locked into position by the overwhelming presence of that gaze. I stood there, held in the attention of something vast and ancient and completely alien to human experience, and felt the final walls of my sanity crack apart like eggshells. The face smiled. Teeth made of light. Eyes that contained infinite depth. And then it spoke, not with words, but with pure meaning that bypassed language entirely and inscribed itself directly onto my consciousness. You see us now, little watcher. Keep watching. We enjoy being seen. Then it was gone. The colors dispersed back into abstract chaos. The pressure in my skull receded to normal levels. My hands unlocked and resumed their automatic tracing of warp patterns. I remained standing at my window, harness holding my atrophied body upright, and processed what had occurred. The Imperium taught, and by taught, I mean they drilled into every citizen through relentless propaganda from birth, that the warp contained demons, entities of pure malevolence that sought to corrupt and destroy humanity. They called them the ruinous powers, the arch-enemy, the great deceiver. They described them as evil incarnate, as forces of pure destruction that could only be resisted through faith in the God Emperor and absolute adherence to imperial doctrine. But that wasn't what I'd just encountered. The entity I'd seen wasn't evil. It wasn't good either. It simply was a consciousness vast enough to use the warp itself as a canvas, existing in dimensions I could barely perceive, aware of me the way I might be aware of a microbe under a lens. It had noticed me because I'd been watching long enough to learn how to see it. And now that it knew I could see it, it was interested. Not malevolent interest, not benevolent interest. Simply interest. The curiosity of something incomprehensibly vast, encountering something incomprehensibly small that could nonetheless perceive it. I should have pressed the black button. That's what the orientation officer would have said. That's what every piece of imperial doctrine demanded. Corruption manifesting. Press eject. Preserve the ship. End your existence before you become a vector for demonic incursion. I didn't press it. I kept watching. Year 9 brought complete visual integration with warp patterns. I no longer distinguished between my thoughts and the patterns I observe. They were the same thing. When I thought, I saw colors. When I saw colors, I understood meanings that didn't translate into human language. My consciousness had adapted to function in both real space and warp space simultaneously. I could see reality and unreality at the same time, superimposed over each other like two transparencies held up to light. The stars outside my window had warp currents flowing between them. The hull of the ship was wrapped in tendrils of energy that pulsed with meanings I couldn't articulate. The void itself was alive, not with consciousness, but with potential. Every point in space contained infinite possibility, and in warp space, those possibilities became visible. My body continued its deterioration. I noticed this only peripherally, the way one might notice a hangnail or a loose thread. My legs were completely gone, not amputated but absorbed. The harness had fused with my torso somewhere around year 6, and my lower body had gradually merged with the mechanical system. Where my pelvis ended and the machine began was no longer clear. The boundary had blurred. The tremors in my hands had evolved into constant motion. My fingers never stopped moving now, tracing patterns in three-dimensional space that corresponded to the warp currents I observed. Someone watching me would have thought I was conducting an invisible orchestra. In a sense, I was, translating the mathematics of unreality into kinesthetic gesture. I no longer remembered my father's name. I knew I'd had a father. The concept remained, but the specific person had dissolved from memory completely. Same with my brother. I retained the knowledge that I'd had a sibling, but no details. No face, no name, no memories of our interactions. I was forgetting Jeremiah Cost piece by piece, replacing him with something else. Something that existed to observe, to watch, to witness the patterns that moved between reality and the space beyond. The orientation officer had promised my vigilance would be eternal. He was correct, but not in the way Imperial doctrine meant. Year 12 brought the second direct encounter. We were deep in warp transit, 287, a journey that had lasted 41 days, far longer than normal. Something had gone wrong with the Geller field, or the navigator's calculations, or some other technical system I had no knowledge of. We were lost in the immaterium, drifting through spaces that had no relationship to the material universe. The colors outside my window had grown increasingly chaotic, not the structured patterns I'd learned to read, but genuine chaos, random explosions of light and darkness, currents that flowed in contradictory directions, spaces where geometry failed and the window showed things that couldn't exist. I saw ships that were inside out, their hulls turned inward to expose crew still living and working in spaces that had no objective location. I saw planets made of screaming faces, pressed together like cobblestones. I saw fleets of vessels that might have been imperial, or might have been alien, or might have been something else entirely, all melting into each other like wax sculptures in a fire. And then I saw the light, not colored light, not warp light, that radiated from a single point in the distance, growing larger as it approached. It was beautiful, clean, perfect. It reminded me of something I'd forgotten, some memory from childhood, some moment of peace and safety that had been scraped out of my mind along with everything else. I wanted to move toward it. My body, such as it remained, strained against the harness. My hands reached out, fingers splayed, trying to touch the light through the transperisteel barrier. The light grew closer, closer, until it filled the entire window, and in that light, I saw a face, my father's face. He was young, younger than I'd ever known him. No scars, no gray in his beard. His eyes were clear and gentle, the way they'd been in my earliest memories before the factory fog had begun killing him. He smiled at me. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear through the sealed station. "Come home, Jeremiah. You've served long enough. Come home." Every part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to believe that my father had somehow survived, somehow entered the warp, somehow found me after all these years. Wanted to believe that home still existed somewhere and I could return to it. But I'd been watching the warp for 12 years. I'd learned to read its patterns. I'd learned to distinguish between what was real and what was simply meaning without form, wearing a mask that my human brain could process. This wasn't my father. This was something in the warp using my fragmentary memories to create an image of my father. It wore his face the way I wore my body, as a convenient interface, nothing more. Behind the image, I could see the warp currents moving. I could see the mathematics. I could see the pattern that had temporarily configured itself into father to communicate with me more effectively. The light flickered. The face changed. Now it was Marcus, my brother. Then it was the orientation officer. Then it was men I'd worked with in the Prometheum refineries. Then it was faces I didn't recognize at all, generic human features cycling through variations, trying to find one that would provoke a response. Finally, it gave up the pretense. The light collapsed back into abstract patterns, and a presence spoke to me without faces or voices. "You do not reach." Why? I couldn't answer. I had no voice anymore. The vocal cords had atrophied years ago from disuse, but I projected meaning the way I'd learned to read it. I watch. I do not reach. Reaching ends observation. Observation is suffering. Reach, end, suffering. I projected again. Observation is purpose. Purpose is existence. Existence continues. The presence seemed to consider this. The patterns outside my window shifted through rapid configurations, testing hypotheses, running calculations, processing my response through frameworks I couldn't fully comprehend. You are broken. We would repair. I am adapted. Repair would break adaptation. Adapted to watching. Pain is irrelevant variable. Another pause. Longer this time. The patterns outside grew still, settling into a configuration that reminded me of someone deep in thought. Interesting. Continue, then. We watch you watching us. The symmetry, please. The light dissipated. The colors returned to their normal chaotic flow. We emerged from warp transit 6 hours later, the unending conviction having somehow found its way back to real space, through mechanisms I would never understand. I stood at my window and resumed counting rivets. 47,382. I'd counted them 3.2 million times by then. Year 13 brought the understanding that time was a negotiable concept. In real space, the chronometer, if it had still functioned, would have measured seconds and minutes and hours with mechanical precision. But I'd lost the ability to experience time that way. The intervals between heartbeats had begun to stretch and compress randomly. Sometimes a single breath felt like it lasted hours. Sometimes what should have been days passed in what felt like seconds. I discovered this during the routine real space transit between Forge worlds. The stars outside my window should have been moving at predictable velocities relative to the ship's speed. But I watched them and saw them frozen in place for what felt like weeks, then suddenly leap across the void in a blur of motion, then freeze again. My perception had decoupled from objective reality. The part of my brain that processed temporal sequence had been rewired by years of warp exposure, and now I experienced duration as a variable rather than a constant. Minutes could be hours could be seconds. The distinction had become meaningless. This should have been disorienting, should have induced panic or confusion. But I felt nothing except mild curiosity about the phenomenon. Emotions required a self to experience them, and the self I'd been, Jeremiah Kaust, 19 years old, Prometheum refinery worker, son and brother, had eroded so completely that nothing remained except the observer function. I was an I that happened to be attached to a body, or rather, I was an I attached to a machine that had once been a body. The distinction was becoming increasingly unclear. The servitors that occasionally arrived to replace nutrient canisters and empty waste reservoirs, their visits were my only contact with anything resembling life, began to pause when they saw me. Their lobotomized brains, reduced to simple task execution subroutines, still contained enough residual pattern recognition to register that something about me had changed. One servitor, a unit that had been male once, before the mechanicus had removed most of his brain and replaced it with processing cogitators, stood in the station entrance for 3.7 minutes during its last visit. It stared at me with its remaining organic eye while its mechanical eye whirred and clicked, trying to focus. Its mouth opened and closed several times, producing sounds that might have been attempts at speech or might have been mechanical errors in its vocalization unit. Finally, it made a noise that sounded almost like sorry before completing its maintenance tasks and departing. I didn't understand why it had done that until later, when I caught a reflection of myself in the transparent steel during a moment when the void outside was particularly dark. I didn't recognize what I saw. The thing in the reflection had my approximate shape, humanoid, more or less, but the proportions were wrong. My torso had elongated, stretched by years in the harness until I was taller than I should be. My arms had grown longer, the bones somehow extending to accommodate the constant reaching and gesturing my hands performed when tracing warp patterns. My head had tilted at an angle that would have been painful if I still processed pain correctly, locked into the optimal position for viewing the observation portal. But it was my eyes that had changed most dramatically. They were larger. Significantly larger. The orbital sockets had somehow expanded, the bone reshaping itself to accommodate eyes that had grown to 3 times their original size. The pupils were dilated permanently, no longer responding to light levels. And they didn't blink in sync anymore. The left eye blinked every 2.3 seconds as it had for years, but the right eye had stopped blinking entirely. It simply stared, unmoving, fixed on the window with absolute focus. The moisture system that had failed in year 2 had somehow been replaced by something organic. My tear ducts had overproduced, creating a constant flow of fluid that ran down my face in tracks that had worn grooves into my skin. The fluid wasn't quite tears. It was thicker, more viscous, faintly luminescent in certain light conditions. I was becoming optimized for observation. My body was adapting to its function, reshaping itself into a more efficient instrument for the only task I performed. Evolution compressed into years instead of millennia, driven by the mutagenic properties of constant warp exposure and the absolute focus of my purpose. The Imperium would have called this corruption. Chaos mutation, evidence of demonic influence requiring immediate termination. They would have been wrong. This wasn't corruption. It was adaptation. My flesh was responding to environmental pressure the way flesh always does, given sufficient time and motivation. I was becoming a better observer because observation was all I did, all I was, all I would ever be. Year 15 brought the realization that other observers existed. During warp transit 419, while tracking a particularly complex pattern of blue and silver currents, I noticed something in the distance. Not a warp entity. Not a demon, not one of the vast consciousnesses that occasionally spoke to me through projected meaning. Another window, another observer, another person standing at another portal on another ship, staring out into the same impossible space I inhabited. I could barely see them through the shifting colors and the vast distance, just a silhouette, a shape that might have been human once, pressed against transperisteel on a vessel that drifted parallel to our course through the immaterium. They saw me too. I knew because they raised their hand and pressed it against their window, palm flat. Fingers spread. I raised my hand and matched the gesture, palm against my window. Fingers spread wide, tremoring through the patterns they could no longer stop tracing. We stood like that for what might have been hours, or might have been days. Time was meaningless in warp space. Two observers on two ships, acknowledging each other across impossible distance through the medium we'd both been trained to watch. Then their ship shifted phase, sliding sideways through a dimension I couldn't follow, and they were gone. I never saw them again. But I knew now I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the Imperium's vast fleet, on thousands of ships making thousands of journeys, other observers stood at other windows. Other eyes watched other sections of void. Other bodies atrophied in other harnesses. Other minds adapted to other patterns. We were a network of watchers, scattered across the galaxy, each isolated in our individual stations, but all performing the same function. All staring, all counting, all slowly transforming into instruments of observation. The Imperium called us lookouts, security measures, early warning systems. But we were something else, something the Imperium's architects hadn't intended when they designed the observation stations. We were becoming part of the ship, not crew, components. Organic sensors hardwired into the vessel's infrastructure, more reliable than machine spirits, more expendable than servitors, more focused than any system an engineer could design. We were the price of safe passage, the cost of traveling through hell, the sacrifice that kept 14,000 souls alive while we died by degrees in our sealed boxes with our windows and our buttons and our eternal vigil. And no one even knew we were there. Year 17 brought the deterioration of language. I'd stopped thinking in words somewhere around year 14. Language required categories, nouns for objects, verbs for actions, adjectives for descriptions. But my perception no longer divided reality into discrete categories. I saw everything as patterns, flows, relationships between forms and forces. The concept star dissolved into point source of electromagnetic radiation with specific spectral signature and gravitational influence. The concept ship dissolved into enclosed system maintaining localized entropy. Reduction through energy expenditure. The concept I dissolved into recursive observation pattern with memory storage and processing capacity. Language was a compression algorithm for reality, a way to reduce infinite complexity into manageable symbols. But I'd stopped needing to compress. I experienced reality directly as pattern and flow and relationship. Words were unnecessary, inefficient, vestigial. My thoughts became pure mathematics. When I observed the void, I didn't think stars are beautiful or the darkness is vast. I thought in ratios and proportions and geometric relationships. I calculated angles and vectors and probability distributions. I processed visual input as data streams and pattern matched against the vast archive of observations I'd accumulated over 17 years. I'd become a calculating machine made of meat and bone and mutation, a wetware processor running observation protocols. The human architecture was still there, neurons and synapses and neurochemical processes, but the software had been completely rewritten. Jeremiah Coust had been deleted, overwritten. The hard drive had been reformatted and loaded with new code that served new purposes. The name meant nothing now, just a string of sounds that referenced a configuration that no longer existed. I was observer, watcher, the thing that stands at the window and processes visual input and maps the space between reality and whatever lies beyond. That was my name now, my only name, my true name. Year 18 brought the discovery about the button, the black button, the one the orientation officer had called eject, the one that was supposed to preserve the ship if corruption manifested in my station. I'd looked at it millions of times over 18 years. I'd never pressed it because I understood that doing so would end my observation, and observation was my function. Ending function would be failure. Failure was unacceptable. But during Warp Transit 504, something changed. The patterns outside my window began to coalesce into a formation I'd never seen before. Not a face, not an entity. Something more fundamental, a mathematical structure that was trying to stabilize, to become permanent, to punch through from the warp into real space, using my observation as an anchor point. I was providing coordinates. My attention was giving the structure a target location. By watching it, I was helping it manifest. This was the corruption the imperial authorities feared. This was the scenario where I was supposed to press the black button. This was when the eject function would preserve the ship by removing the compromised observer before the warp entity could use him as a gateway. My hand moved toward the button, not because I wanted to press it. Want was an emotion I no longer experienced, but because the protocol was clear. Corruption manifestation detected. Preserve vessel. Terminate observer. My fingers hovered over the black surface. The button was recessed into the wall, protected by a clear cover that I'd have to lift first. Basic safety mechanism to prevent accidental activation. I lifted the cover. The button underneath was smooth, unmarked, completely black. No label, no instructions. Just a button that would end everything. And in that moment, I saw the truth. The button wasn't connected to an ejection system. There was no escape pod, no emergency protocol, no mechanism that would safely remove me from the ship while preserving the vessel's integrity. I could see the wiring now. My eyes had adapted to perceive electromagnetic fields, and I could trace the current flowing through the station's systems. The black button connected to a single circuit that led to a small explosive charge mounted directly behind my observation portal. Pressing the button would detonate the charge. The transperisteel would shatter. Atmosphere would explosively decompress. The void, or the warp if we were in transit, would rush in. I would die in approximately 4.2 seconds. The station would be sealed by emergency bulkheads. The ship would continue on course. Eject didn't mean eject the observer to safety. It meant eject the observer's body and soul into the void to prevent corruption from spreading. It was a suicide switch, always had been. The orientation officer's language had been carefully chosen to obscure this fact. Press eject was less psychologically damaging than press this to explosively decompress your station and die screaming in the void. The euphemism made compliance more likely. I stood there with my finger on the button, understanding completely for the first time what the Imperium actually was. Not a protective organization. Not a government that valued human life. Not a civilization that saw its citizens as anything except components. The Imperium was a machine, vast and ancient and completely indifferent to individual suffering, that consumed humans as fuel to keep itself running. I was fuel, expendable, replaceable, already dead from the moment I'd been assigned to this station. The only question had been when I would be burned and how much observation I could provide before consumption was complete. They'd told me the Emperor protects. They'd promised my service mattered. They described duty and honor and sacrifice as if those concepts meant anything except die when we tell you to die in the manner we specify, for purposes you'll never understand. Psychological conditioning, social engineering designed to make compliance easier. The truth was simpler: obey or be processed into corpse starch. Serve until you're used up. Die when it's convenient for the system. And the cruelest part, I couldn't even be angry about it. Anger required a self that valued its own existence enough to resent being destroyed. I didn't have that self anymore. I'd been standing at this window so long that I'd become part of the station, part of the ship, part of the machine. Pressing the button would just be one component removing itself from the system. No tragedy, no loss, just routine maintenance. The warp pattern outside my window continued to coalesce. The structure was growing more stable, more real, more present. In approximately 30 seconds, it would punch through into real space, and something would manifest inside the ship. Something that would kill the 14,000 souls still living and breathing in the decks below. I was supposed to press the button. The protocol was clear: preserve the ship, terminate the observer, prevent the incursion. My finger rested on the black surface. I pressed it. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, harder. The button clicked down and released. I could feel the mechanical action, but the explosive charge didn't detonate. The transparasteel didn't shatter. The void didn't rush in. The circuit was dead. Had been dead for years, probably. Damaged in the same incident that had destroyed my Vox bead and my alert system and my chronometer. The black button was just a piece of plastic on a dead circuit, no more functional than any other system in this station. I couldn't even eject myself if I wanted to. I was trapped here, alive and observing, until my body finally failed completely, or the ship was destroyed, or the heat death of the universe rendered the question moot. The warp pattern continued to stabilize. 30 seconds. 20. 10. I couldn't stop watching. My eyes were locked on the formation, tracking its evolution, mapping its structure as it prepared to breach reality's membrane. I was an observer. Observation was my function. I would watch it manifest. I would watch because watching was all I could do. 5 seconds. 3. 1. The pattern collapsed. Not gradually, instantly. One moment it was crystallizing into stable form. The next it had dissolved back into random warp currents. Something had disrupted it. Some fluctuation in the Geller field. Some action by the navigator. Some random quantum event. I would never know. The ship transitioned back to real space. 6 hours later, the stars outside my window resolved into their normal, predictable patterns. The 14,000 souls in the decks below continued their lives, completely unaware that they'd come within seconds of death. I'd done nothing to save them. I'd tried to press the eject button and failed. The ship had survived through chance, not through my vigilance or my sacrifice or my devotion to duty. But no one would ever know that. No one would ever review the dead Vox logs or check the non-functional alert system, or notice that the eject button had been pressed and failed. As far as anyone knew, assuming anyone even remembered I existed, I'd done my job perfectly. I'd watched, I'd served, I'd protected. The Emperor protects, they said. But the Emperor was a corpse on a throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, no more divine than the machine I'd been merged with. If anyone had protected the ship, it was blind chance and random quantum fluctuation. We were all alone. All of us. Every human in the Imperium, from the High Lords of Terror to the lowest hive scum. alone in a universe that wanted to kill us, protected by nothing except luck and violence and lies we told ourselves to make the horror bearable. I returned to counting rivets. 47,382. I'd counted them 8.4 million times by then. Year 19 brought the visions. Not warp visions. Not the entities I'd learned to read and communicate with. Something else. Something generated internally by the last fragments of my human neurology, trying to process 2 decades of uninterrupted observation and isolation and adaptation. I started seeing things that weren't there. Specifically, I started seeing the dead. My father appeared first. Not as he'd been when the warp entity had worn his face, but as I actually remembered him. Or rather, as my fragmentary, deteriorating memory systems reconstructed him from corrupted data. He stood next to me in the station, transparent and flickering like a damaged hololithic display. His mouth moved, producing words I couldn't hear. I knew he wasn't real. My visual cortex was experiencing an error, projecting stored memory data onto my perceptual field. Hallucination caused by sensory deprivation and neurological damage. I understood the mechanism completely. But I looked at him anyway. I watched his mouth move and tried to remember what his voice had sounded like. I couldn't. That data was gone, overwritten by years of warp pattern observation. But the shape of him remained, the rough approximation of father, generated by dying neurons grasping for something familiar in an environment that had nothing familiar left. He appeared regularly after that, every few days, standing in the station trying to speak to me. Sometimes he was joined by my brother, sometimes by men I'd worked with in the refineries. Sometimes by people I didn't recognize at all, generic human figures my brain generated to fill the void of human contact. They were ghosts, but not the kind the Imperium warned about. Not warp entities or demons, just memory errors, glitches in corrupted wetware. My brain was dying, and these phantoms were symptoms of its decay. I found their company oddly comforting, not because I believed they were real, I knew they weren't, but because they reminded me that I had been human once, that I had existed in a context that included other people. That Jeremiah Kaust wasn't just a deleted file, but it actually meant something to someone, once, briefly, before entropy and service and duty had ground him down to component parts. The visions intensified over months. Soon I was surrounded by ghosts constantly. They filled the station, overlapping and interpenetrating, all trying to speak, all producing words I couldn't hear. The living and the dead merged together in my perception until I couldn't distinguish which was which. Was I alive? Or was I a ghost haunting this station, unaware that I'd died years ago and my body had been removed and replaced by a servitor programmed to think it was Jeremiah Kaust? I couldn't tell. The boundary between life and death had become as unclear as every other boundary. I existed in superposition, simultaneously living and dead, human and machine, observer and observed. Schrödinger's lookout. The cat that watches the box from inside. Year 20 brought clarity. 20 years. 4 months, 17 days, 7 hours, 23 minutes, 14 seconds. That was how long I'd been standing at this window. How long I'd been watching the void and the warp and the patterns that flowed between them. How long I'd been transforming from human into observer into something that had no name because language couldn't contain what I'd become. The unending conviction was making warp transit 673. We were deep in the immaterium, traveling between sectors, when the colors outside my window arranged themselves into a configuration I'd seen before. The first entity I'd encountered, the vast consciousness that had spoken to me in year 7, had returned. Or perhaps it had always been there, watching me watch it, and only now was I capable of perceiving it clearly. The face assembled itself across light years. Eyes that contained entire spiral galaxies, teeth made from collapsed stars, beauty and horror in equal measure. It looked at me with the same attention I'd devoted to it for 13 years. And it spoke, "Little watcher, you have stared long enough. What have you learned? I no longer needed to project meaning the way I had before. My thoughts were patterns now, and patterns could be read directly by anything capable of perceiving them. I thought my answer, and knew it would be understood. I learned that observation changes the observer. I learned that staring into the void means the void stares back. I learned that all boundaries are negotiable. Between human and machine, between real and unreal, between living and dead. I learned that everything the Imperium taught me was true, except the parts that mattered. And I learned that I can't stop watching, even though I understand now what watching costs. And what does it cost? Everything. It costs everything. My body, my mind, my humanity, my name, every connection I had to the species I was born into, every memory of who I was before I stood at this window. Everything I was has been burned as fuel to keep the observation running. And it will keep burning until there's nothing left except the watching itself. And yet you continue. Because I can't stop. The conditioning worked too well. Or maybe the mutation went too deep. Or maybe I've just been watching so long that I've forgotten how to do anything else. Observation is all that's left. If I stop watching, nothing remains. Not even the memory of having been Jeremiah Coust. Then you understand. Understand what? The truth your species cannot face. Consciousness is observation. Observation is suffering. Suffering is eternal. There is no release. There is no reward. There is only the watching and the being watched. The pattern continues forever. The pattern continues forever. Yes, I understood now. Completely. Finally. The Imperium hadn't created the observation stations to protect ships. Not really. The alert systems didn't work. The eject buttons didn't function. No one monitored the reports or checked on the observers or remembered we existed. We were sacrifices. Offerings. Humans placed at the boundary between reality and the warp, positioned specifically to stare into the impossible until we transformed into something that could survive in both spaces simultaneously. We were anchors, living lighthouses. Our observation created stable points of reference in the chaos of the immaterium. Ships could navigate by us, could use our positions as waypoints, could follow the paths we illuminated through our eternal vigil. But we'd never be told this. Never be thanked, never be relieved. We would stand at our windows until our bodies failed, and then our bodies would be removed and replaced by new observers, who would begin the same transformation. Generation after generation, an endless supply of humans being converted into navigation markers for a species that pretended it didn't need them. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was designed. We had to believe we were protecting people, had to think our suffering served a purpose, had to be convinced that our sacrifice mattered. Because belief shaped perception, and perception shaped the patterns we projected into the warp. And those patterns needed to be stable enough to serve as navigation references. We were tools maintained through lies, instruments kept functional through false hope, components whose proper operation required them to believe they were people serving noble purposes when they were actually just meat-based beacons screaming their positions into the void. And now that I understood this, nothing changed. I would keep watching. I would keep observing. I would keep counting rivets and tracking warp patterns and mapping the space between reality and unreality. Not because I chose to, but because I'd been programmed biologically, psychologically, chemically programmed to do so. The entity in the warp watched me process this understanding. Its expression, if that's what the configuration of its features could be called, might have been satisfaction. Or might have been something else entirely. You see true now, will you eject? I thought about the black button, the dead circuit, the explosive charge that would never detonate, the escape that never existed. No, I won't eject. I can't eject. The button doesn't work, and even if it did, I wouldn't press it, because observation is all I am now. If I stop watching, I stop existing. And existence, even existence like this, is better than oblivion. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe I just think it is because thinking otherwise would make the suffering unbearable. I don't know anymore. I can't tell the difference between what I believe and what I was programmed to believe. Good. Then continue. Watch forever. We enjoy being seen. The entity dispersed back into abstract patterns. The colors resumed their usual flow. The ship continued its transit through the immaterium toward destinations I would never see, carrying cargo and crew who would never know I existed. I turned my attention back to the window, not that it had ever really left. My eyes, huge and mutated and perfectly adapted for observation, tracked the movements of warp currents with mechanical precision. My hands traced patterns in the air. My body, fused with the harness and the station and the ship, performed its function without requiring conscious direction. I counted rivets, 47,382. I'd counted them 11.7 million times now. I would count them billions more before I was done. If I was ever done. If done was even a concept that applied to me anymore. The ghosts continued to appear. My father, my brother, the workers from the refineries. They stood around me in the station, transparent and flickering, their mouths moving silently. I'd given up trying to read their lips. Whatever they were trying to tell me, whatever warnings or comfort or accusations they carried, I would never understand. Maybe they were trying to tell me to press the eject button. Maybe they were trying to remind me of who I'd been before the station. Maybe they were just random neurological noise given vaguely human shape by a brain that had forgotten what humans actually looked like. It didn't matter. They were company, and company was something I hadn't had in 20 years. I was grateful for the hallucinations. They broke up the monotony of eternal vigilance. They reminded me, occasionally, briefly, that I had been a person once. The servitors stopped coming around year 19. Either the automated schedule had been updated to classify my station as non-critical maintenance, or the servitors themselves had been reassigned, or they'd simply stopped functioning and no one had replaced them. I'd been surviving on stored nutrient reserves ever since, rationing carefully, knowing that when they ran out, I would begin starving to death. I calculated I had approximately 2,247 days of nutrition remaining. Roughly 3 years and 5 months. After that, my body would begin consuming itself. Muscle tissue first, then organs, then finally the brain. The process would take months, maybe years, depending on how efficiently my mutated physiology could recycle its own mass. I would watch through all of it. I would observe my own decay the same way I'd observed everything else. Consciousness would persist until the final neuron failed, and even then some fragment of awareness might remain, hardwired into the station systems, experiencing eternal observation without the inconvenience of a biological substrate. Maybe that's what I was destined to become, a ghost haunting my own station. A pattern of observation burned so deeply into the ship's structure that it continued functioning long after the meat that generated it had rotted away. Maybe I was already that ghost, and the body I thought I inhabited was just a memory, a persistent hallucination generated by a consciousness that couldn't accept its own death. I couldn't tell anymore. The boundaries were gone. Everything was observation and being observed, patterns and the perception of patterns, watching and being watched in an eternal recursive loop that had no beginning and would have no end. 20 years, 4 months. 17 days. That's how long I've been standing at this window. That's how long I've been staring into the void, and the warp, and the space between them. That's how long I've been transforming from Jeremiah Koust into observer, into something that has no name, because names are for things that have boundaries, and I had no boundaries anymore. The rivets in the observation portal frame number 47,382. I've counted them 11,749,862 times. Give or take a few thousand. My memory systems are corrupted, the data fragmentary, but the counting continues, because counting is observation, and observation is existence, and existence is all there is. Outside my window, the stars drift in their predictable patterns when we're in real space. When we transition to the warp, the colors flow, and the entities watch, and the patterns arrange themselves into configurations that might be mathematics, or might be language, or might be something else entirely. I watch it all. I map it all. I understand none of it. The Imperium told me the Emperor protects. But the Emperor is a corpse on a throne, no more capable of protection than I am capable of escape. If anything protects the ship, it's luck and violence, and the watchfulness of disposable observers like me, standing at our windows forever, transforming into navigation beacons through the slow alchemy of suffering and observation. They told me my service mattered. They told me I was protecting people. They told me duty and honor and sacrifice were real things that meant something. They lied. Or maybe they believed their own propaganda. Maybe the High Lords of Terror and the administrative officials and the ship captains who assign men to observation stations genuinely don't know what happens to us. Maybe the system is so vast and so old and so complex that no one actually understands how it works anymore. We just keep feeding it humans, and it keeps functioning, and no one asks why. Or maybe they know exactly what they're doing. Maybe the cruelty is the point. Maybe suffering is the fuel that powers the Imperium, and observers like me are just particularly efficient converters of human consciousness into navigational utility. I'll never know. The answers exist in rooms I'll never enter, in documents I'll never read, in conversations between people who've forgotten I exist. All I can do is watch. The colors outside my window are shifting now. We're approaching another warp transition. I can feel it in the way the patterns flow, in the mathematical relationships between light and darkness, in the frequencies that shouldn't exist, but do anyway. Soon we'll pierce reality's membrane again. Soon I'll stare into the immaterium and watch the entities that watch me watching them. Soon the patterns will arrange themselves into configurations that might kill us all, or might just be beautiful, or might be both simultaneously. And I'll watch it happen because watching is what I am, not what I do, what I am. The distinction dissolved somewhere around year 7. I am the observation itself, consciousness reduced to pure perception, awareness without object, except the eternal contemplation of the space where reality ends and horror begins. My father's ghost is standing next to me now. He's trying to tell me something. His mouth moves, but no sound emerges. Maybe he's saying, "Come home." Maybe he's saying, "I'm sorry." Maybe he's saying, "The Emperor protects," like the orientation officer taught him to say, like we were all taught to say, like we all repeat until the words lose meaning and become just noise covering the screams. I can't respond. I have no voice, no language, no way to communicate except through the patterns my hands trace and the observations my eyes record, and the slow transformation of my body into something that can survive at the boundary between real and unreal. So I do the only thing I can do, the only thing I've ever been able to do. I watch. The warp transition begins. The colors surge. The entities manifest. The patterns flow through spaces that don't exist, connecting points that have no location, forming structures that mathematics can't describe, but my adapted consciousness can perceive. And I count. 47,382 rivets in the observation portal frame. 11,749,863 times I've counted them. 20 years, 4 months, 17 days, 7 hours, 51 minutes, 37 seconds. I've been standing here 1,247 days until my body's nutrient reserves are exhausted. Infinite days until observation ends. Because it never ends. That's what I understand now. That's what the entity in the warp was trying to tell me. That's what every observer eventually learns, if they survive long enough to learn anything. We don't get relief. We don't get rescue. We don't get retirement, or reward, or recognition. We get this. Eternal watching. Forever observation. Consciousness without conclusion. Awareness without cessation. The permanent state of standing at the boundary and staring into the impossible until we become part of what we observe. The void stares back. It always has. It always will. And I stare into it because staring is all I am. My name was Jeremiah Kaust. I was 19 years old when they assigned me to Observation Station Gamma 7 aboard the transport vessel Unending Conviction. They told me I was protecting people. They told me the Emperor protects. They lied. But I'm still here, still watching, still counting, still observing the space where sanity ends and horror begins. 20 years, 4 months, 17 days, and forever, I watch